August 42, 4 p.m. 5 Marine M3 Stuart light tanks rumbled across a blood-soaked sandbar on Guadalcanal, their treads crushing everything in their path. Japanese soldiers, some dead, some dying, some still firing, disappeared beneath 15 tons of American steel. General Vandegrift would later write in his report, "The rear of the tanks looked like meat grinders." But this wasn't the beginning. This was the end. The climax of a 14-hour nightmare that started when 900 Japanese soldiers charged across an open creek into concentrated machine gun fire, believing their warrior spirit could overcome American firepower. This is the story of 3 men. An island scout who crawled through a jungle with his throat cut open. A Japanese colonel who believed honor mattered more than victory. And a 19-year-old Marine machine gunner who would never sleep soundly again. The first time the Imperial Japanese Army was defeated in a major land battle, the night 800 men charged into hell, and the intelligence failure that sent them there. This account is based on documented historical records, veteran testimonies, and official military reports from the Battle of the Tenaru, August 21, 1942. All major events, casualties, outcomes, and named individuals are historically accurate. 3 months earlier, in May 1940, Private Tadashi Suzuki sat on the deck of a transport ship bound for the Philippines, writing a letter home to his wife Keiko in Osaka. He was 23 years old, married 6 months, called up for military service 4 months ago. "The officers tell us we are going somewhere important," he wrote in careful characters. "They say the Americans are weak, that they will not fight when they see Japanese soldiers. I do not know if this is true, but I will do my duty. I think of you every day. Kiss our daughter for me. Tell her Papa will come home soon." He had no idea he was writing his last letter home, no idea that in 3 months he would die on a sandbar in the Solomon Islands, shot through the chest while charging a machine gun nest, one of 800 men who fell in a single night. Tadashi had been a school teacher before the war. He taught mathematics to children in Osaka. He loved his job, loved watching students understand concepts that had confused them. He had never wanted to be a soldier, but Japan needed him. The emperor called, duty demanded, so Private Tadashi Suzuki became part of Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki's 28th Infantry Regiment, bound for the Philippines and then to a jungle island called Guadalcanal. The letter reached Keiko 3 months later, delivered by an army officer who brought news that her husband had died gloriously in battle, defending the empire. The officer did not mention that Tadashi had charged across open ground into machine gun fire, did not mention that his body was crushed beneath tank treads, did not mention that his death accomplished nothing. Keiko kept the letter for the rest of her life. After the war, she remarried, had other children, but she never forgot Tadashi, never stopped wondering what his last moments had been like on that distant island she could never visit. In July 1942, Jacob Vouza stood on a hillside overlooking Guadalcanal's north coast and watched the horizon fill with American ships. He was 42 years old, a native of Guadalcanal who had served in the British Solomon Islands Protectorate Police Force before the war. When the Japanese arrived in early 1942, they installed a brutal occupation. Villages burned, people disappeared. Anyone suspected of helping the Allies faced torture and execution. But Jacob never stopped resisting. He became a coast watcher, part of a network of islanders and Europeans who stayed behind enemy lines, reporting Japanese movements by radio. It was dangerous. If captured, coast watchers were executed as spies. But this was his island, his people, his home. He thought of his childhood, running through these same jungles with his brothers, learning to track animals, learning to move silently through dense foliage, learning to read signs that others missed. His father had been a master tracker, had taught Jacob everything. "The jungle talks to those who listen," his father had said. "You must learn its language." Now, those skills would save American lives. When the Marines landed on August 7th and captured the Japanese airfield at Lunga Point, renaming it Henderson Field, Jacob volunteered immediately to serve as a scout. The young Americans treated him with respect, gave him an American flag as a symbol of their alliance. Jacob carried it with pride. For 2 weeks, he guided Marine patrols through the jungle, warning them of Japanese positions, helping them avoid ambushes. On August 19th, he joined Captain Charles Brush's patrol heading east toward Coley Point. At noon, moving through dense jungle inland from the beach, Jacob heard something, a faint metallic clanking, voices speaking Japanese. Through the foliage they saw movement, Japanese soldiers, at least 30. Captain Brush made a split-second decision. Ambush them. Don't let them report back about American positions. The Marines opened fire. Within minutes, 34 Japanese soldiers lay dead. Only 5 escaped. Among the dead was a communications officer carrying maps, codebooks, and orders. When Marine intelligence examined these documents, they realized something terrifying. This wasn't just a patrol. This was advance party for a major assault. But they didn't know where, or how many, or when. 2 weeks earlier, on the night of August 9th, just 2 days after the American landing on Guadalcanal, the intelligence failure that would doom Colonel Ichiki began. A Japanese naval force commanded by Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa attacked the Allied fleet, protecting the invasion. In less than an hour, the Japanese sank 4 heavy cruisers and damaged 2 others. Over 1,000 Allied sailors died. It was one of the worst defeats in U.S. Navy history, and it had consequences beyond the immediate battle, because the shocked Allied naval commanders withdrew the rest of the fleet, taking the transport ships that were still unloading supplies. The Marines on Guadalcanal were suddenly isolated, cut off. Only Japanese commanders knew about the naval victory immediately. What they didn't know was that the Marines had already unloaded most of their supplies and equipment, that 11,000 troops were dug in around Henderson Field with artillery, tanks, and adequate ammunition. Japanese reconnaissance aircraft flew over Guadalcanal on August 12th and reported seeing few troops in the open, few ships offshore. The intelligence officers concluded that the Americans had withdrawn most of their forces after Savo Island. They estimated perhaps 2,000 Marines remained. The actual number was 11,000. This intelligence failure would doom Colonel Ichiki and his regiment, because when General Harukichi Hyakutakek ordered a counterattack to recapture the airfield, he based his plan on the flawed estimate of enemy strength. "Send Colonel Ichiki immediately," Hyakutake ordered. "With 900 men, that will be sufficient. The Americans are weak. demoralized. They will break. On August 18th, Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki stood on the beach at Taivu Point and watched his troops disembark from destroyers that had raced down the slot under cover of darkness. 917 men, the advance echelon of his 28th Infantry Regiment. Veterans, elite troops. He was 45 years old, a professional soldier who had served in Manchuria and China. He had seen combat, watched Chinese nationalist forces break and run when Japanese troops charged with fixed bayonets. He believed absolutely in Japanese military superiority, in Bushido, in the warrior spirit that made Japanese soldiers the finest fighters in the world. But that night, alone in his tent, Ichiki wrote in his journal words he would never have shared with his officers. "We are fewer than I would prefer. Intelligence says the Americans are weak, but I have learned to distrust intelligence. Officers see what they want to see, report what commanders want to hear. Tomorrow we march west. In 3 days we attack. My orders are clear. Recapture the airfield. Destroy the Americans. I will do my duty. But I pray the intelligence is correct. 900 men is not enough if the Americans are strong." He paused, brush hovering over paper, then added, "If we fail, if I do not return, tell my wife I died with honor, that I served the Emperor faithfully, that I did not disgrace our family name." It was the closest Ichiki would come to admitting doubt, to acknowledging that this mission might be suicide. He sealed the journal, planning to mail it home after the victory. It would be found on his body 3 days later, stained with blood, and sent to his widow with the official notification of his death. On the afternoon of August 20th, Private First Class John Rivers checked his M1 Garand for the 3rd time that day. He was 19 years old, from a small town in Nebraska. Joined the Marines 6 months ago because his older brother was in the Army, and their father had served in the First World War. He had been on Guadalcanal exactly 2 weeks. 2 weeks of digging foxholes, eating half rations, fighting malaria, and waiting for the Japanese counterattack everyone said was coming. Tonight, he would man a .30 caliber machine gun position near Alligator Creek. His first time as primary gunner. His assistant gunner was supposed to be an experienced corporal, but the corporal was in the hospital with dysentery. So Rivers would be paired with another private fresh from training. He was terrified, tried not to show it, but his hands shook when he cleaned his rifle. Staff Sergeant William Ash noticed. Ash was 28, ancient by Marine standards, married with a daughter he'd never met. He had a way of noticing things. "First time on the gun?" Ash asked. "Yes, Sergeant." "You know how to fire it?" "Yes, Sergeant." "Training, but not in combat." "Combat's different," Ash said. "Louder, faster, more confusing, but the gun works the same. Short bursts, aim low, don't fire until you see targets. Save your ammunition." "What if I freeze?" Ash looked at him. "You won't. When it starts, your training takes over. You'll do fine." Rivers wanted to believe him, wanted to believe that training would be enough. But he'd heard stories from guys who'd been in combat, how it was chaos, how people forgot everything they'd learned, how good Marines died because they made mistakes. "One more thing," Ash said. "Don't look at their faces. Look at center mass. If you start seeing them as people, it gets harder." Rivers nodded. Didn't understand yet what Ash meant. Would understand perfectly by morning. That same afternoon, at 4 p.m. near Taivu Point, Private Tadashi Suzuki cleaned his Arisaka rifle and thought about his wife. It had been 3 months since he'd seen Keiko. 3 months since he'd held his infant daughter. The military mail was irregular. He'd received only 2 letters since leaving Japan. He wondered if Keiko had received his letters, if she knew he was thinking of her constantly, if she understood that he didn't want to be here, didn't want to fight, but had no choice. Around him, other soldiers prepared for the coming march. Officers inspected equipment, sergeants checked ammunition. Everyone knew tonight they would move west toward the American airfield. Tomorrow, they would attack. Tadashi wasn't afraid of dying. He had accepted that possibility when he was conscripted. What frightened him was the thought of his daughter growing up without a father, without knowing him, becoming a stranger. "Suzuki!" his sergeant called. "Fall in. Colonel wants to address the troops." Tadashi grabbed his rifle and joined the formation. 917 men assembled on the beach. Colonel Ichiki stood before them, sword at his side. "Tomorrow we attack the Americans," Ichiki said. "Intelligence reports they are weak, demoralized, few in number. When they see Japanese soldiers charging with fixed bayonets, they will break. They will run. We will recapture the airfield and restore Japanese honor. Some of you may die. That is the soldier's path. But you will die with honor. Die serving the emperor. Die knowing you did your duty." The troops shouted approval. "Banzai! Banzai!" Voices echoing across the beach. Tadashi shouted too, but in his heart he wondered, what if the intelligence is wrong? What if the Americans don't run? He pushed the thought away. Doubt was weakness. He would do his duty. At 2 p.m. that same day, back near the marine perimeter, Jacob Vouza volunteered to scout east toward Taivu Point. It was dangerous. He would be alone, deep behind enemy lines, with no radio and no backup. "I find them," he told the Marine officers. "I come back. I tell you where." He left the perimeter at 2 p.m. moving through jungle trails he'd walked since childhood. The heat was oppressive. Insects swarmed. But Jacob moved silently, carefully, watching for signs. At 4 p.m. near Taivu Point, he found them. Hundreds of Japanese soldiers, perhaps 1,000, forming up. Officers shouting orders, troops checking equipment and fixing bayonets. This wasn't a patrol. This was an army preparing to attack. Jacob needed to get back immediately. He turned to slip away and walked straight into a Japanese patrol. They grabbed him, found the American flag in his pack. That was enough. The Japanese soldiers tied Jacob to a tree and began interrogating him. Where were the American positions? How many troops? What weapons? Where were the artillery batteries? Jacob refused to answer, refused even to acknowledge he understood. They beat him with rifle butts. He stayed silent. They stabbed him in the chest with bayonets. Blood ran down his torso. He clenched his teeth and said nothing. Private Tadashi Suzuki watched the interrogation from 20 yards away. He had been assigned perimeter security for the command post. He watched the islander tied to the tree, watched his own countrymen torture the man, watched blood pour from bayonet wounds. The islander never screamed, never begged, just stared at his interrogators with absolute defiance. Tadashi felt sick. This wasn't combat. This was cruelty. But he said nothing, did nothing, just watched. Finally, a Japanese officer drew his sword and sliced open the islander's throat. The wound gaped. Blood poured. The officer wiped his blade clean and walked away. "Leave him," the officer ordered. "He'll be dead in minutes. We have more important things to do." Tadashi followed his unit away from the tree. But he looked back once, saw the islander still alive, still conscious, eyes open, still defiant even as he bled out. That image would haunt Tadashi for the remaining 3 hours of his life. As evening approached, Jacob Vouza should have died. The throat wound alone was fatal. Add the bayonet wounds in his chest, and survival was impossible. But Jacob didn't die, because if he died, the Marines would have no warning. Hundreds of young Americans would be killed in a surprise attack because he failed to deliver his message. So he didn't die. He worked his hands free of the ropes. 20 minutes, fingers slippery with blood, rope tight. But he persisted until the bonds came loose. Then he began crawling west toward the Marine lines, through jungle undergrowth, over fallen logs, through streams. He couldn't breathe properly. The throat wound made every breath agony. Blood loss made him dizzy. His vision blurred. His chest screamed with every movement. But he kept crawling. 4 hours, 4 miles. He thought of his father, teaching him to track in these jungles. Thought of his wife and children waiting for him. Thought of the young American Marines who treated him with respect, who gave him their flag. He couldn't let them die, so he crawled. At 10:30 p.m., the Marine sentries at a listening post near Alligator Creek almost shot him. In the darkness, they saw movement, raised their rifles, started to fire. Then they saw the flag clutched in bloody hands. "Don't shoot! Don't shoot! It's Vouza!" They carried him to the battalion aid station, shouting for a doctor. Lieutenant Commander Malcolm Pratt took one look and couldn't believe the man was alive. "Plasma! Get me plasma now!" But Jacob grabbed the doctor's arm with surprising strength. Through his ruined throat, forcing out words, Japanese, many Japanese, maybe 500, maybe more. They come tonight, soon, very soon. Then he passed out. The message reached Lieutenant Colonel Edwin Pollock at 10:45 p.m. He grabbed his field telephone. "Full alert. This is not a drill. Expect contact within the hour. Nobody fires until you have a clear target. Fix bayonets." At 11:47 p.m., the jungle went silent. Private John Rivers crouched behind his machine gun and felt the silence like physical weight. The insects stopped. The birds stopped. Even the wind died. "Something's coming," his assistant gunner whispered. At midnight, they heard it. Metal clanking. Voices in Japanese, chanting, growing louder. At 12:30 a.m. on August 21st, the first Japanese soldiers emerged from the jungle on the far side of Alligator Creek. They formed up in ranks on the sandbar. More kept coming. Dozens, hundreds. The Marines watched in stunned silence. This wasn't a tactical advance. This was a mass formation preparing to charge straight at them. At 1:30 a.m., a Japanese officer raised his sword and screamed. 900 voices roared in response. They charged. Private Rivers opened fire. His machine gun chattered, brass casings flying, tracer rounds drawing red lines through darkness. Other guns joined in. Rifles cracked. The 37mm anti-tank guns began firing canister rounds, shells that exploded at the muzzle, releasing clouds of steel balls like enormous shotgun blasts. The front rank of Japanese soldiers disappeared, cut down by intersecting fields of fire. But more kept coming, stepping over bodies, splashing through water, turning red, screaming, believing their warrior spirit would carry them through. Private Tadashi Suzuki was in the second wave. He saw the front rank fall, saw men cut down by machine gun fire, but he kept running, because to stop was to die anyway. because his officers were behind him with swords, ready to cut down anyone who retreated, because duty demanded it. He made it 20 yards into the creek before a bullet hit him in the chest. The impact spun him around. He fell face down in shallow water. The last thing he thought of was Keiko's face, his daughter's laugh, the classroom where he taught mathematics, then nothing. Private Rivers didn't see Tadashi fall, didn't see any individual soldier, just masses of targets. He fired in short bursts like training taught him, aimed low, watched his tracers find targets, watched bodies fall. He didn't think, just operated the gun mechanically, firing, pausing, firing again. Some Japanese soldiers made it across, 20, maybe 30. They crashed into Marine positions with bayonets, hand-to-hand fighting in foxholes. Rivers felt someone grab his gun from behind, a Japanese soldier who'd gotten past the front line. Rivers pulled his .45 pistol and fired point blank. The soldier fell. Another took his place. Rivers fired again. Reserve Marines counterattacked, charged forward with rifles and submachine guns, clearing the breach. The hand-to-hand fighting lasted 5 minutes. Then surviving Japanese attackers fell back across the creek. In the sudden quiet, Rivers heard wounded crying, some Japanese, some American, both sides calling for help in languages neither understood. At 2:30 a.m., Colonel Ichiki watched the first assault fail and felt doubt turn to dread. At least 150 men dead, maybe 200, and they hadn't even reached the American defensive line. His officers stood silent, faces showing shock. "We attack again," Ichiki ordered. "They will break. They must break." But his voice lacked conviction. The second wave charged at 2:30 a.m. 200 men, officers in the lead, waving swords. The Marines opened fire again. Machine guns, rifles, artillery shells exploding among Japanese forces still massing on the east bank. The second assault lasted 10 minutes. Not one Japanese soldier reached Marine positions. The creek mouth was choked with bodies. At 5 a.m., Ichiki ordered a third attack, this time attempting to wade through ocean surf and attack up the beach. Marine machine gunners shifted fire 30 yards north and cut them down in the water. By 6 a.m., as the sun rose, the assault was over. Nearly 700 Japanese soldiers lay dead or dying on the sandbar in the creek and along the beach. Perhaps 200 survived, retreating into jungle east of the creek. The Marines had suffered 35 dead and 75 wounded. As dawn broke, Private Rivers sat beside his machine gun, hands shaking. The barrel was too hot to touch. Spent brass littered the ground, and across the creek, as far as he could see, lay bodies. Staff Sergeant Ash approached, looked at the bodies, looked at Rivers. "You did good," Ash said quietly. Rivers started crying, couldn't stop himself. 19 years old, had just killed perhaps 20 men, maybe more. He'd never know the exact number. "I can't—" Rivers couldn't finish the sentence. "I know," Ash said. "First time's hardest. It'll get easier." But that was a lie, and Ash knew it. It wouldn't get easier. Rivers would carry this night for the rest of his life. Across the creek, in a coconut grove, Colonel Ichiki knelt before a solshi, and his sword lay across his lap. Around him, the remnants of his regiment hid in the trees. Perhaps 100 men. Out of 917, he had failed. Failed his emperor, failed his men, failed his family. There was only one honorable response to such failure. Ichiki positioned his sword blade toward his abdomen, whispered a prayer, then thrust forward with both hands. The pain was extraordinary but brief. His adjutant stepped forward and completed the ritual with a single sword stroke. Colonel Kiyono Ichiki was 45 years old. His body would be found by Marine patrols later that morning, sword still clutched in his hands. At 9 a.m., General Alexander Vandegrift walked along the creek, studying Japanese dead, trying to understand what kind of commander would order such an attack. "They knew we were here," he said to Colonel Pollock, "knew we had machine guns and artillery, and they charged straight at us anyway." Intelligence officers searched the dead, collecting documents, found Colonel Ichiki's journal on his body, found orders, found letters from home to soldiers who would never read them. Private Tadashi Suzuki's body was found at 10 a.m. In his uniform pocket, an unfinished letter to his wife. Water-stained, blood-stained, but readable. A Marine intelligence officer translated it, added it to the collection of captured documents, noted the soldier's name and unit, but the letter itself was lost in bureaucratic processing. Keiko would never know her husband's last words, would never know he was thinking of her when he died. At 4 p.m., Japanese soldiers still alive in the coconut grove were refusing to surrender. Some fired at Marine patrols, others played dead, then attacked when Americans came close. Vandegrift ordered 5 M3 Stuart tanks to cross the creek and clear the grove. The tanks rumbled forward, their treads crushed corpses. Their machine guns and 37mm cannons veered into the palms. Japanese soldiers who could move tried to run. The tanks hunted them down. Japanese soldiers who couldn't move, wounded, dying, or playing dead, were crushed beneath 15 tons of steel. Private Rivers watched from the American side of the creek, watched the tanks hunt human beings, watched bodies disappear beneath the treads. He vomited. "Jesus Christ," someone said. "This isn't war, this is butchery." But it was necessary. The Japanese had shown they wouldn't surrender, would play dead and attack medics. Every Marine who approached a dead Japanese soldier risked being killed, so the Marines stopped taking chances. When the tank attack was over, Vandegrift walked through the grove and saw what his tanks had done. Later wrote, "The rear of the tanks looked like meat grinders." 800 Japanese soldiers died at the Battle of the Tenaru. 15 severely wounded were taken prisoner. About 30 escaped back to Japanese lines. 3 days later, on August the 24th, Jacob Vouza regained consciousness in the field hospital. Doctors had performed emergency surgery, given him blood transfusions, antibiotics, pain medication, done everything they could, but they didn't expect him to survive. When Jacob opened his eyes, the doctor standing over him looked shocked. "You're awake!" Jacob tried to speak. The words came out as a hoarse whisper. "Marines win." "Yes, you warned us. We were ready. We won." Jacob smiled. "Good, I sleep now." He didn't die. Against all medical expectations, Jacob Vouza recovered. 3 months later, he was back in the jungle, scouting for Marines, wearing the silver-starred General Vandegrift personally pinned to his chest. In September 1940, in Osaka, Japan, Keiko Suzuki answered the door and saw an army officer standing there, hat in hand. Before he spoke, she knew. "Your husband died with honor," the officer said, "defending the empire, fighting the Americans in the Solomon Islands." Keiko bowed, thanked him, accepted the official letter of notification. After he left, she sat with her infant daughter and cried, not for the empire, not for honor, just for Tadashi, the school teacher who loved mathematics, who never wanted to be a soldier, who wrote her letters about coming home. She kept his last letter for the rest of her life. After the war, she remarried, had other children, but she never forgot Tadashi, never stopped wondering what his last moments had been like. In 1988, 43 years after the battle, an American historian researching Guadalcanal found Tadashi's unfinished letter in a military archive, tracked down Keiko's address through Japanese records, sent her a translation. She was 70 years old, read the letter, cried again for the young man she'd loved, the father her daughter never knew. He was thinking of us, she told her children. Even at the end, he was thinking of us. In February 1946, Private First Class John Rivers returned home to Nebraska, survived Guadalcanal, survived 2 more campaigns, received the Bronze Star for heroism. He married his high school sweetheart, had children, worked at a hardware store, lived a quiet life, but he never slept soundly again. Never forgot the night he killed 20 men, maybe more. Never forgot the sound machine gun made when it fired, the smell of cordite and blood, the faces in the darkness. His wife learned not to wake him suddenly. He would come awake swinging, thinking he was back on Guadalcanal, back behind the gun. His children learned not to ask about the war. He wouldn't talk about it, couldn't talk about it. In 1982, a local newspaper interviewed him for a story about World War II veterans. The reporter asked, "Did you ever regret killing enemy soldiers?" Rivers was silent for a long time, then said, "Every day. They were just men, like me. They had families, homes, dreams, but they were trying to kill me, so I killed them first. That's war. Nobody wins. Some just lose less than others." He died in 2004 at age 81. His obituary mentioned he was a Marine veteran of the Pacific War. Didn't mention Guadalcanal, didn't mention the machine gun, didn't mention the 800 dead. In 1984, Jacob Vouza stood at the mouth of Alligator Creek, now called the Elu River, and looked at the sandbar where 800 men had died 42 years earlier. He was 84 years old, still living on Guadalcanal, still proud of what he'd done. A group of American tourists approached him, recognized him from the memorial plaque nearby. "You're Jacob Vouza?" one asked. "The man who crawled through the jungle with his throat cut?" "Yes." "That was incredibly brave." Jacob shook his head. "Not brave, necessary. The Marines were my friends. I could not let my friends die. So I did not die." He paused, looked at the creek. "Many men died here, Japanese, American, all doing their duty. War is a terrible thing, makes enemies of men who might have been friends." Jacob died 7 months later, in March 1984. The island erected a statue in his honor. The British knighted him. The American government gave him citizenship. His funeral was attended by hundreds. Marine veterans flew from America to pay their respects. Japanese veterans sent letters of condolence. One letter from a Japanese survivor of the battle read, "I saw what your countrymen did to my friends after the battle, but I also learned that you tried to save Japanese wounded when you could. You understood we were all human, all suffering. Thank you for your humanity in the midst of madness." The Battle of the Tenaru changed the Pacific War in ways neither side fully understood at the time. For Americans, it proved that Japanese soldiers, while brave and determined, could be defeated with superior firepower and proper tactics. The myth of Japanese invincibility, built on victories in China and Southeast Asia, was broken. Marines learned they could survive Japanese attacks, could win battles, could hold territory. For the Japanese, Tenaru was a catastrophic wake-up call. Elite troops had been annihilated in a single night because commanders ignored basic military principles, intelligence failures, inadequate reconnaissance, arrogant assumptions about enemy capabilities. These mistakes cost 800 lives. After Tenaru, Japanese commanders gradually abandoned Banzai charges as primary tactics. The losses were unsustainable, but the change came too slowly. Similar disasters would happen at Edson's Ridge, at Tarawa, at Saipan. Thousands more Japanese soldiers would die in human wave assaults that military science said couldn't succeed. The psychological impact was profound. Japanese soldiers who survived Tenaru carried stories back to their units about American machine guns that never seemed to run out of ammunition, about artillery that fell with terrifying accuracy, about tanks that hunted wounded soldiers through coconut groves. Fear began to replace confidence. Doubt began to replace certainty. American soldiers learned different lessons. That firepower wins battles. That preparation prevents casualties. But also that victory requires crushing enemy resistance completely. That mercy in combat can get you killed. The sanitized version of history calls Tenaru a great American victory. 800 enemy dead for 35 American losses. A triumph of preparation and firepower. But the men who were there knew the truth. That war is horror. That killing 800 men, even enemy soldiers, isn't something to celebrate. That both sides suffered losses that could never be measured in casualty figures. Rivers lost his innocence, spent the rest of his life haunted by faces he couldn't forget. Tadashi lost his life, left a wife and daughter who mourned him for decades. Ichiki lost his honor, died knowing his tactical failures killed his regiment. And Jacob? Jacob survived, became a hero, but carried scars, physical and psychological, for the rest of his life. The sandbar at Alligator Creek is still there. Tourists visit, stand where Marines stood, look across to where Japanese soldiers charged. The blood is long gone, washed away by rain and tide. The bodies were buried decades ago, but if you stand there quietly at dawn, when the light is just right, some say you can still hear echoes, machine guns, screams, 800 men charging into hell because commanders believed courage could overcome firepower. They were wrong, but their sacrifice, on both sides, deserves to be remembered, not celebrated, not glorified, just remembered. Because the real lesson of the Battle of the Tenaru isn't that Americans won. It's that war destroys everyone it touches, winners and losers, survivors and dead, heroes and cowards. 800 Japanese families received letters saying their sons, brothers, and fathers died with honor. The letters didn't mention that superior firepower defeated superior courage in exactly the way military science predicted. 35 American families received similar letters. Their sons had died defending freedom, stopping Japanese aggression, making the world safe for democracy. Both sides' letters told the same lie, that there was meaning in the deaths, purpose, nobility. The truth is simpler and harder. Young men died because old men made mistakes, because intelligence failed, because doctrine was flawed, because war is chaos, and chaos kills. The only real hero of the Battle of the Tenaru was Jacob Vouza, not because he killed anyone, but because he refused to die when dying was easier than living, because he crawled through a jungle with fatal wounds to save his friends. That's the story worth remembering. Not the 800 dead, not the tactical victory, not the military lessons, but one man crawling through darkness, refusing to quit, saving hundreds of lives with a warning delivered through a ruined throat. Sometimes the greatest acts of war aren't acts of violence. They're acts of endurance, of determination, of refusing to accept defeat when everything says you should. Jacob Vouza understood something that generals often forget. War isn't won by those who kill the most enemies. It's won by those who refuse to stop fighting for their friends. That's the real lesson of the Battle of the Tenaru.